Hi everyone, this is Jamie, and welcome to another episode of the Yogi Within podcast. So I'm just checking this is working all right. Um, okay, this is another one a little bit on the fly. I've got a bit of time to do this today. Someone else asked me about this. And this is also related to some conversations I've had recently with students that comes up often in yoga practice, and I think this is good to cover. Now, the title of this, I guess we could call this Moksha or Nirvana, but I think maybe it could be related to the feeling of being good enough, or we could talk about words like freedom, liberation. These are words that often come up in yogic practices and texts, and I'm going to give my thoughts around that and how this relates to our yoga practice, and really how these conceptual ideas, which they seem to be, when we think about things like nirvana or this forever state of bliss or this liberation of our soul, sometimes they can feel like these very like fantasy in some ways when we hear people talk about these concepts of enlightened beings or people reaching these enlightened states. They are very, for a lot of us, can feel very far away and not achievable. And even if it is something that we actually want to achieve, but I'm going to talk about this a little bit more from a grassroots level that's more applicable for our everyday lives, really. And potentially this being a pathway to different states of consciousness. This will make sense a little bit later. But let's start with a classification of some of these words. Let's start with the word moksha. Now, the sort of classical interpretation of this, mok meaning to be free. This is in Sanskrit, to be free. You could interpret this in many different ways, to be free or liberated, but ultimately, and this is the same in Buddhism with nirvana, is that you're escaping the cycle of samsara. Samsara being, the ever cyclical reincarnation of our physical self, so that we keep coming back. The idea is to potentially escape that or avoid this. Maybe these are the wrong words, escape and avoid, but karmically and energetically, we are not reborn in the same way we are in the physical body. So a lot of Buddhist traditions will kind of focus on this in the sense that you're elevating yourself in some way, you're elevating yourself energetically, karmically, and that you don't have to go through this painful recycle, the painful attachment to the physical body, the painful attachment to this material world. And there's these other states of being energetically that are potentially free from this karmic attachment to our material world. So I'm not going to go into that massively today on this podcast. I'm going to talk about this. I might do that another day, but on this podcast, I'm going to talk about this more in terms of our everyday life. But conceptually, these are what we might be looking to attain in our yogic practices and our meditation practices. I've talked to Ian Greisack and a few other practitioners over the years about this, and whether this is even something that's possible, and even talking to seasoned meditation and yogic practitioners and monks, potentially for many of us, it might not be, and it might not be something we want to even achieve. And I've actually never met anyone. I've never met a monk or a lama or anyone who is remotely been close to someone who has potentially reached some of those states. So it would be interesting to have a conversation with someone who might have actually potentially reached some of these enlightened states. But I've definitely met what I would call enlightened people over the years who've definitely reached a more liberated way of being, and you could say have more freedom in their physical and body, but in their mind. Yeah, and I'll go into this a little bit later. So we could think about this realizing ourselves or seeing ourselves in a truer way. I talk about truth a lot on this podcast because I believe truth and love are the gateways to these different states. So these don't happen in lower vibrational states. They definitely, my experience of reaching what I would say is a more liberated way of being or thinking comes from truth and love. Other states are not achieved. Other ways of thinking don't really take you into those places. I've talked about that a lot on previous podcasts. But love, the feeling of love and truth, to me, those are the gateway into different states of consciousness, which I would class as higher in some ways, and I'm talking about that from a felt experience, as in weight, something that feels heavy or something that feels light. A lighter feeling in the body and mind comes from truth and love. But so we could say that moksha, nirvana, these different sorts of states that are a goal potentially in spiritual practices. But a word I think of a lot when I think of freedom and liberation in Sanskrit is a word called svatantara. Now, svatantara, we could describe that as having one's own freedom. So we could think about being independent, being original in our own way, and we could think of this in a sense of having our own freedom, our own personal individual freedom. And I think about this in layers. I think when most of us as daily practitioners, I think this is the best place to start, because if there is an embodied state of consciousness that we could class as nirvana, or being in this heightened state of love, energy, freedom, bliss, liberation, if that just feels too conceptual for us, I think what we have to start with is our own independence, our own sense of freedom, and our own sense of originality in our own body and our own world where we are currently in our life. I talked with Ian on the podcast recently about self-sovereignty, and this is related in a way, because we need that in our lives currently. We need that sensation and that feeling in our embodied state as human beings. If we don't have that feeling in ourselves, if we don't have that sense of self-sovereignty, independence, freedom, originality, if we don't really know who we are or why we choose certain things, why we choose certain actions, and what's driving us, what's the truth behind the things that we do, the way we choose things, then I think these higher states are very far away from us. I think we have to start there. We have to start with who we are as we know ourselves as we are now, and why we choose what we choose. This comes back to truth in my mind. This comes back to, knowing who you are. I said this on a previous podcast. Yoga is about knowing yourself, in all ways, in your deepest way, and finding out your deepest truth and what drives you, why you choose certain things, why you choose certain paths, and why you don't choose certain things. And this could come back to liberation and freedom. What stops you from doing certain things, and what keeps you confined potentially to where you are, and you might feel stagnant or stagnated. This for me is fear. I've talked about fear a lot on this podcast, and I'll relate this to a conversation I've had with a few students lately. Fear and attachment. These will stop things quicker than anything else I could think of in my life, is when we have fear and too much attachment and really a lack of originality. And what I mean by that is like being who you really are, knowing who you are at a core level, and not afraid to be that person, to be the original person who you are, where you're not trying to conform, you're not necessarily trying too hard to fit in, and you don't feel attached so strongly to the things that you do. To me, this is at the basis of the sense of moksha, or you could say the basis of the sense of svatantara, where we feel less attached to our material world. We're not so attached to the things that are in our lives. We have more of a love energy, and we have a sense of liberation in the sense that we have freedom of choice. Yeah, you're not so worried about what other people think. You're not too conditioned by group mentality or groupthink. You're not afraid to stand out. You're not afraid to be on your own as an individual. One of my students classed this as radical. What did she say? She classed this as radical. You know, this way of thinking in a sense as potentially radical. To me, this is not radical. To me, this is like a baseline, really, of what yoga practice encompass. What I believe is what your yoga practices should be teaching you is to be an independent, original person. Yeah. When I think about yogis and what they were originally doing, pre-Hinduism, pre-Jainism and Buddhism, going back to the origins of yoga, these were people that were disillusioned with society. They were disillusioned with the way things were going, and they were rebellious. Yeah, they were rebellious to conforming to things that they didn't like and didn't agree with, and they weren't afraid to try and do different things. They were fearless. This is why we think about words like Virabhadrasana, or you think of warrior postures. There's always these conceptual ideas and images within yoga of strength and being fierce. When I think about the artwork and the imagery from the Vajrayana traditions and Tibetan Buddhism, there are always these really strong, fierce images to embody that. Yeah, we're looking to embody these fierce, strong and emboldened deities in a way for us to sort of relate to. We want to relate to things that are strong. We want to relate to images. We want to relate to ideas that make us feel brave, that make us feel courageous, and they give us the strength to go into these practices and to be courageous and not to be afraid of not conforming, to thinking differently, to thinking independently without so much attachment. So really, again, it comes down to fear. You know, this is why, yoga in the modern world has this sort of fluffy, I've said this sometimes on previous podcasts around this spa, health, wellness sort of thing, but I don't relate to that in any way really when I think of yoga. I think of yoga as this deep dive into transformative, courageous, hard's the wrong way. It just breaks fear, it breaks attachment, it breaks avoidance, it breaks conformity, it breaks groupthink. To me, authentic yoga practices are a path to liberation in the sense that the intention behind them is to do that. The reason people created these practices, the reason they went into the woods and created ashrams was to be around like-minded people who were trying to think different. They were actively trying to think different. They were trying to control their mind. They were trying to control their thoughts so that they weren't so confined. Yeah, liberation of the mind is that you're not confined to groupthink. You're not confined to herd mentality. You're not confined to a rigid way of thinking about things. You're open. Yeah, you're open to new ideas, alternative ways of being and thinking. And to do that, you have to be courageous. You have to have less fear. You have to be willing to do something different. You have to be willing to let go of things. Yeah, you have to let go of certain types of attachment, especially the ones that aren't serving you. And this was a conversation I had with a student this week, was having a very strong attachment to something that is definitely not serving someone. Yeah, it's not helping that person. Yoga, meditation, is a pathway into understanding why we have such strong attachments. Yeah, why we're so attached to certain ways of thinking. Why is it scary to stand out on your own? Yeah, I've talked about this on a previous podcast. about being alone and feeling isolated, yogic practices should liberate you from that way of thinking, where you're not afraid to be on your own, you're not afraid to be alone, you're not afraid of losing things. You're freer, you're more liberated. And this is what I mean at more of a grassroots level, is that we can practice those things daily. Yeah, we can practice those things in our lives currently as we are, without thinking about these very far away ideas around self-realization or being in eternal states of bliss. We have to start at a grassroots level. What are the things that make you feel frightened? Why are you afraid of being alone? Why are you so attached to something that doesn't make you happy? Why are you so attached to something that's weighing you down or keeping you stuck somewhere? These are all the things that we deal with on a day to week, yearly basis. Yeah, we all have these thoughts that come up. Our body talks to us. Our yoga practice brings these to the surface because it's doing its job. Yeah, your yoga practice should be bringing these things to the surface. Things that make you feel uncomfortable, things that you've been avoiding, or things that you're trying to push away because there's some fear associated to that. Fear, avoidance, create tension in my experience. Yeah, these are not love energy. Yeah, fear and avoidance is the opposite of love. Being open and accepting things as they are, or being accepting that things change, that everything is in a state of flux. This is intrinsic to yogic traditions. Is liberating. Yeah, it's liberating to understand that everything is flowing and moving and changing. And then when we become too attached to things, we start to feel tension, we start to get anxious, we start to worry, we feel less free, and our vibration starts to drop down and we feel stagnated and things aren't moving. You're kind of going against reality with these ways of thinking, which is what I think really is the grassroots level of moksha, or the grassroots level of breaking certain cycles, breaking certain ways of thinking, so that you feel more liberated. Yeah. Again, my student classed this as radical. You could class this as radical, but I would say that it would make you happier. So if potentially a more radical way of thinking or looking at life, you could class traditional yoga as radical, maybe a more radical way of looking at life. But if it makes you feel happier, less heavy, less tension, more liberated, more free, to me that's a better way of being, which is why I've chosen to focus so much of my energy into learning these disciplines, so that you challenge the way you think, you challenge the way you see things, and that usually means letting go of things. Yeah, usually these practices, in my experience, year after year, you just start letting go of more and more and more things, and to me that's liberating. Yeah, it doesn't mean that you can't love someone or something. This is something I got asked recently: is how can you be non-attached to something, but also not be distant and avoidant? And I said that distance and avoidance or fear is not love. Love is being able to let something go. Yeah, I've said this on a previous podcast. When you're in love with someone, you love them enough to let them go. Yeah, relationships I've had, really, as much as you might want that person in your life, to love them is to let them go. And that's the same with anything. Sometimes things are better with us not in that space. Sometimes things are better when we're not involved in those things. Sometimes people evolve and move forward without us. And I think that coming to terms with that and being accepting of that, even if that means losing something, is reality, and it's truer, and you'll feel a stronger sense of love and bliss when we're less attached to those things. And I don't mean that you can't miss someone or be in love, but it also means sometimes letting go. Now, something that came up with this was around not being good enough, we could say, and relating to yoga actually, and the yoga systems. And this is specifically more to the Ashtanga yoga system, I would say, around control. And we could relate this to potentially teachers or ways of teaching yoga in the Ashtanga yoga system as being too rigid and too controlling. Again, this comes down to intention, yeah? There's lots of different reasons a student might be held at a posture, or the system itself within Ashtanga yoga. There's reasons why some students might be stopped at certain postures or being held in different places. But it all comes down to the intention. I think, as I've spoken about on previous podcasts, when there's too much gatekeeping with postures and it becomes too rigid just to be traditional in some way, then I think this leads to more fear, and I think this leads to more too much control, and I think this creates more of a negative energy around people's practices. And what I've witnessed in a lot of students is it becomes something that they want to achieve. And I think that the best thing you can do in your yoga practice, especially Ashtanga yoga, is to let go of achieving postures. Yeah, achieving something, I relate that more to sports, competitive sports, and performative things. The best thing that happened in my own yoga practice was not applying that to yoga. Again, I had a background in competitive sports. I'll go into some similarities in that later, but it's better to just think of postures as postures. There's one after the other, and it's great to work on them and to have effort and to experience what the feeling is like when we're in these different asanas. But when students get too much focused on achieving them, or perfecting them is probably a better word, this creates a different association to the practice, where postures become something you want to conquer or achieve, and it's this this left hemispheric way of thinking, of control, manipulation, and wanting to own it. It becomes an attachment thing again, yeah. And I think if students are doing that too much, they become way too attached to asana, way too attached to the outcome of the asana, and then potentially a yoga practice turns into this other control mechanism that's got nothing to do with moksha, liberation, freedom, svatantara, these different words that refer to independence and freedom. And I think these are a deeper level of our yoga practice. And as I've said before, I believe you are what you practice. And if you're practicing that every day on your mat, that you're trying to achieve a posture, and then you're getting annoyed with yourself or frustrated because you couldn't do what you did last week, or you couldn't do what you did yesterday, and then there's this negative cycle, this negative attachment, and it becomes this really, not toxic, maybe that's too strong a word, but it's definitely not yoga, yeah? It becomes some sort of performative gymnastics exercise. And to be honest, I would say that's largely what I've seen in a lot of yoga rooms, is more performative gym, left hemispheric way of using the body to try to obtain something, control it, manipulate it. And then the mind gets involved, and then there's a negative feeling that comes up. Yeah, we're all, unfortunately, a lot of us, in the Western school system, we're taught this from a very early age, yeah, of performing, and you're doing well if you pass your test. You're congratulated for winning and passing and succeeding, and there's a negative energy. You didn't do good enough, you failed this, you failed that comes from, I would say it really starts at school for most of us, and my school wasn't great for that, and this moves us on more so when we get more into sports and competitive sports, and again, there's different ways to practice that. But I think that when you're too focused on the outcome of something, it's important to find out what's driving that. Yeah, what's the reason that we need to achieve something? Like, who are we doing that for? Yeah, who are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to catch your heels in Capitasana? And if you don't do that, it's bad. And if you do that, it's good. I would say that neither of those are true. Yeah, it's not bad if you don't do it. It's not good if you do it. It's more about being in the moment and experiencing what's going on in your body and your consciousness and your subconsciousness before, during, and after your yoga practice. This, to me, is the interesting part. Whether you do something more deeply one day to the other will rely on a myriad of different things, such as sleep, stress, water intake, how many different things affect your ability to physically do something. If you're just using that as a measurement tool every day, your yoga practice will just become a measurement of how physically well you can do something. And unfortunately, this has become the yardstick of yoga practice in the West these days. It's very much performative asana. It's better to move beyond that. Yeah. Again, moksha, freedom, liberation. To me, these are the words that come up when I think of yoga. And if you're confining your mind into how well you did something physically one day to the other, this is not liberation. This is not freedom. You're creating a prison for yourself that no one else really potentially is creating for you, of measuring yourself from a day-to-day perspective on how well you didn't do something. This is not liberating. This potentially creates a negative energy, and something I had a discussion with a student recently about not being good enough. Yeah, this is unfortunately a lot of us struggle with that. Yeah, where we can think of lots of different ways to measure ourselves of whether we're good or we're not good enough for something. This might help you if you're trying to be the best athlete in the world. Yeah, I don't think it makes people happy, but it might make you perform well if you're doing a competitive sport. But yoga is not a competitive sport. Yeah, athletes, high-level athletes, are not liberated or free. Yeah, they're often injured, stressed, potentially narcissistic, and not very balanced. Yeah, I'm not dissing athletes. I was one for many years, but I was definitely some of those things potentially during those years. Now, there's different ways to approach these things. Yeah, when I used to do competitive sports and I was entering tournaments and competing, some people just loved to be there. I did. Obviously, I wanted to win. I wanted to get a gold medal. I wanted to be the top. That's the environment I was in. But I loved being in a competitive environment. I liked being in the environment itself, yeah. I liked the fact that I was a bit scared. I liked that I was anxious. I liked being in that space. I felt alive. I felt on my edge. I talked about that recently around tapas, finding the edge. And I think someone asked me this. I would have done it if no one else was watching. Yeah. Let's break this down. Some people perform in competitive things not because they want to be there. They want to get it over with. Yeah. They want the medal. They want to post about it online afterwards, and they want the accolade. They want the attention and the feeling it gives them afterwards. But they don't like the process. They don't like the training. They don't like the actual competition themselves. They want to get in and out. Yeah, it's like one and done. Get in, get out, win, post online about it. Great. Some people love being there. They love the feeling of being in that space. They like the preparation. They like the training. They like the process. Yeah, they're embodied actually. They're very present in the thing that they're doing. And I would say I fell into that group. I loved that part of it. I was talking to one of my students who's a boxing coach. He used to be a professional boxer. And we were talking about different ways to approach competition and things like that. And we were discussing around some fighters having so much fear and anxiety that they don't perform on the day and they just want to get it over with. And I said, well, if you have one of your fighters that's like that, he's going to struggle because he will potentially be fighting someone who loves being there. And I've met lots of different people over the years in fighting sports who love being in there. They love fighting. They like being in that space and zone. They don't really care if they win, actually. And those people do very well because they're not trying to get it over with. They're not trying to get the medal at the end. They're there for the experience. They're there for what happens psychologically in their body. They like the feeling of being on their edge and what's going on. And I think that we can think about that in some ways with our yoga practice. It's called to post things maybe online to say you've completed an asana because maybe you've worked on it for many years and there's a sense of achievement there. I think that's interesting. I think that's cool. It's nice sometimes to see how well and how you've progressed in something after so many years. But I would very much say that it's better to think about the process. It's better to think about how you are before, during and after your yoga practice. How are you psychologically? What comes up in the process of doing those things? We're not looking to achieve things. It's more around what happens to our state of being before, during and after. I would say that this is more secure in that way, yeah? I think performative things, achievement things in that way, I wouldn't say that that comes from an insecure place, but what I would say is it's important to understand why we do things. Yeah, I had to ask myself this question many years ago around why was I doing these practices? Why was I competing in fighting sports or other competitions? Why did I want to win a gold medal? Why was it important to me to be the best at that thing? What was driving that? And I think for a lot of us, yoga practice is about asking those questions. Yeah. A good example of yoga would be, how is your yoga practice when no one's watching? Yeah. How is it when you're on your own? How do you practice when you're on your own as opposed to when other people are around? Or if you're doing something that's exposed in that way? I think that these are good questions that me and Ian Greisack talked about a little bit on the last podcast, because from a personal experience, from my own personal view, my yoga practice is pretty much the same. It's a totally personal thing, you know. How I practice on my mat at home it's the same, you know. I put the same energy into it. I practice with the same sort of effort and intensity. Obviously in a shala and a space you get the lift from other students, and that's cool. It's nice to get that, but it's interesting to think about how our practices are when we're on our own. And I think the people that really love the process, they love the introspection, they love going into their mind and their body, they would do it with no one watching. Yeah, it was not so important who sees it. It's not so important whether you measure it or not. It's not so important what other people think about it. It's more important about how it personally feels to you. And I think that that's a good sign that your yoga practice is authentic in that way. Like you're doing it for you. Yeah, you're practicing for you. What goes on your mat, what goes on in your mind, the depth of wisdom that's gained from those practices and processes. And it's not an external gym practice. It's not an externalized stretching and strength practice where we're trying to perform something. Yeah, yoga practice is mixed. Yeah, I love teaching and learning techniques. This is a conversation I had with a student recently. I love teaching my students different techniques. I love seeing them progress and learn things and become more strong and supple. You know, that's also a sense of liberation, yeah, is having less pain in the body, being able to move more freely. You know, I definitely feel that on a felt level. You know, being liberated in the body affects the mind in the same way, yeah. There's less tension, less resistance, we move with more ease. This is liberating. Yeah, this is another reason why I chose yoga as a practice. It's liberating to feel like that in your body. How you feel in your body has a lot to do with how you feel in your mind. Yeah, when you have less physical pain and you can move with ease and more freedom, this is liberating. This is a grassroots sensation of moksha. You feel more free. You feel more liberated. This is what we're looking for. But you're not liberating your mind if you're confining yourself into a measurement of how far you can stretch or how strong you are. And this is what I'm trying to get over in this podcast, is this is not liberating. Yeah, this is not, you're not practicing moksha, you're not practicing svatantara, you're not practicing liberating your mind if you're confining yourself in your yoga practice to measurements. Ashtanga gets a bad rep for being strict in the sense that there's this set sequence, yeah, but it depends on how you approach it. It's definitely good for people to do spontaneous things, and if you're thinking about balance, bandha, students that are too rigid and dogmatic in that way, that can get a little bit, I can do that. I can get very focused and, like a bit like a train on the track. I'm moving forward, but it is important to balance it out with some spontaneous things. I definitely recommend that to students that are of that nature, is to balance out your practices with some spontaneous things. Now and then I will do some spontaneous dynamic meditations, which is sort of dance related in some ways. I do teach that sometimes, but they're more movement meditations that's more around spontaneous movement, and I do that just to balance out my natural trait as a as a Taurus. I can be a little bit on a train track sometimes, which is great for focus and discipline, but I need to balance myself out in that way so I don't become too focused like that. When you're measuring yourself in that way, let go of that. I would totally recommend just let go of measuring things, let go of the comparisons of day to day and stuff like that. It's just much better just breathe, move, and see what happens. Move from achieving to flowing. This is sometimes why it's good to really try and stick to the vinyasa count in Ashtanga and not worry so much about how deep you go from day to day, or how your hamstrings are yesterday compared to today. Just move and breathe and be non-attached to what happens. Be less attached to the happenings day to day. This is a practice. This is a practice of non-attachment in a sense, and of comparing and potentially thinking that you're not good enough. This is not yoga. This is probably potentially in some old pattern, some old story. This is something that comes up for lots of people in general, of just, the negative mind, the negative monkey mind. It can keep us down in life. It can hold us back. It can stop us from trying things. It can stop us from believing that we can do things. To me, yoga has definitely taught me that. Anything is possible if you put the right intention and focus into something. Anything is possible. Again, this is this courageousness, not really caring what other people think, being independent and believing in yourself. These are all the things that I believe happen from an authentic yoga practice. These things that naturally happen actually from not necessarily reading about them. These are the things that happen just from having a consistent, regular yoga practice, feeling like things are possible, feeling like things can happen, believing in yourself, and really stopping the monkey mind of saying negative things to ourselves. This is 101 Buddhism. This is how you really start, I would say, in Buddhism. Other than meditation, is negative thoughts. Just saying and repeating negative thoughts that really potentially hold you back. They stop you from trying things, trying new things, changing things. This is, 101 yoga really, and Buddhism, to just, control the negative mind, control that way of thinking, which again is not liberating. This is not, feeling like you're not good enough is not liberating you from anything whatsoever. And if your yoga practice is reinforcing a sensation or a feeling of not being good enough, then I think we have to ask ourselves, what are we practicing when you're practicing yoga? That is not liberating. Again, any practice can be good if it has the right intention, if it has the right philosophical approach. If your yoga practice is being used as a way to confine your way of thinking, to restrict yourself into what you're doing, to confine your mind into a certain way of approaching something, then it can be used in the wrong way. And this could be for anything. This is why I think it's wrong that the Ashtanga system gets a bad rep, that people think it's this rigid, controlling thing, but it's really about how you approach it. I see it in this way. I see it is that I've learned a syllabus of movement. That syllabus allows me to move without thinking too much. It allows me to move in and out of postures with my breath without having to use my mind so much. This becomes, eventually for most students, a relatively mindless, embodied practice. It's a moving meditation in lots of ways, if you can control your mind. If your drishti is good, and your intention for your practice is good, you believe in yourself, you feel confident, and you are going in with the intention of liberation, of freeing yourself from dogmatic ways of thinking. This is something that Ashtanga's got a bad rep for, and I believe that it's really just from bad teaching. To me, this has just become a control mechanism for bad teachers, in some ways. I think that there are excellent Ashtanga teachers out there that see the system in that way. It is a tool for liberation if it's practiced in the right way. When it's practiced in the wrong way, it's a control mechanism. It's a yardstick to measure themselves or their students by and create conformity. It's creating groupthink. It's suppressing critical thinking, and it's suppressing open communication. I've talked about this. I won't go into that on this podcast, but I've talked about that enough. Maybe not enough, actually, but I've spoken about it before around the negative aspects of Ashtanga yoga and the way it can be practiced. And again, creating this, how do you feel when you go to the shala? Is a good question, Do you feel secure? Do you feel open? Do you feel like you can try things? Do you feel like there's freedom in that space for you to do things? Do you believe in yourself in that space? Or do you have a different feeling? This is a conversation that came up recently with students. Different Mysore rooms feel completely different, from the vibe that the teacher is imposing, You have to be very secure in yourself, I believe, to be a good teacher of yoga or any practice really, but especially in yogic practices. But it really is, Mysore rooms are very sensitive spaces. They're very sensitive spaces. It's interesting to think about how you feel in different spaces, whether it's an externalized visual thing or if it's an internalized liberating thing. In my experience of Mysore rooms or yoga rooms in general, when they become too externally focused, liberation and freedom go out the window. Once you become too focused on how you look, what other people think, and you're comparing yourself, these practices are dead in that way. It just becomes stretching, strength work, and there's nothing wrong with that. You'll get some benefit from that, but going back to the purpose of this podcast, grassroots moksha, grassroots practicing freedom and liberation, that's not going to happen now, or not really, or less likely, where it's too much external, too much in the way things look. And I would say that largely comes from some kind of insecure place. When people feel very secure, embodied and confident, they don't really care so much about what other people think, and they're less interested in how things look. The internal processes of yoga become dominant, Yeah, the feelings around feeling freer, more liberated, more secure in yourself, and less what other people think take over, and that becomes the foundation of what your practice is really about. Because really, if you want to go deeper into practices of yoga, this doesn't happen, I believe, when from an insecure place. This doesn't happen from externalizing these things, and it becomes really, it's about fear. It's some sort of fear and attachment again, attachment to your ego in terms of what other people think, and fear around not doing something so well. Again, this feeling of not being good enough, performative. It's important for us to understand where those things come from. Lastly, maybe not lastly, but something else is that sometimes we can feel that we need to be fixed, and that by fixing ourselves, this will liberate us. Yeah, this is a bit nuanced actually. I don't think it's wrong to come to yoga thinking that you want to change something. I think that is correct. Yeah, lots of us come because we feel that we need to change something. Something needs to change. That could be being in physical pain, or even potentially chronic pain, and that's something we want to change. Yeah, that's not wrong. That's one of the reasons we might come to yoga practice. Or inherently we feel something's wrong with us. Yeah, we don't fit in, we don't feel good enough. Some practices we've done before, some people we've listened to before, have maybe reinforced that feeling. And I think that yoga is a path to changing those things. Yeah, there is a path to seeing those things in a different way, feeling that you are in control of your health. You are able to fix your body yourself through embodied movement practices in yoga. So this encourages that. Yeah, this gives us the strength and ability to feel those things and do those things for ourselves. Yeah, we're empowered in that way. And I would say also the practices around feeling liberated come from these practices. Now, how can I word this? If your mind is not involved right now, potentially, you will feel good enough. Yeah. If the mind is not involved, all of us potentially could reach a meditative state where we felt completely fine. You felt in balance. You felt good about yourself. You felt at peace. You felt that you were good enough as you are, and you didn't need anyone else's approval. Potentially you could reach a blissful state, and that might last a certain period. But then those voices come back, those old patterns, these old insecurities, these negative things potentially that other people have told us, and then we're back into this kind of negative vibration. And what I think happens in yoga is that we become more adept and better at dealing with those voices. We stop listening to those old voices. We stop listening to these old patterns, and we start breaking those things. This is what I mean by liberation, yeah? I've done podcasts about samskaras before. We're breaking those negative patterns, yeah? We're breaking our attachment to those negative patterns, because really there is some attachment to that. There's an attachment in some way to that way of thinking. There's an attachment to saying negative things about ourselves, or listening to negative voices and believing them. Yeah, there's something that is not broken, but in something that needs healing. And I think that, again, an authentic practice will heal those things, or at least bring them to the surface where you're aware of them, and you might be able to have a better discussion with someone about where that comes from and how to move forward in your life. So for me, these are the grassroots level of moksha, or liberation, of freedom, is breaking these cycles. It's so important to do this so that we're not trapped in these negative vibrations. Yeah? And again, have a think about how you're using your yoga practice. Yeah, a good example of mine today, was I don't know, just stiffness. What did my teacher used to say? Congested. There's an acceptance that comes from that. Yeah, just letting it be, and not getting too attached to the outcomes of things. And actually, it's probably a good day to do this podcast where that doesn't become a negative thing. It's not an indication of who Jamie is, or how my sense of self-worth or achievement or purpose is not how well I did something. Yeah, whether I did something very well or not very well, it's not based on that. I'm kind of good in my own sense of things, and I'm not so attached to the outcomes of things. And I think this is a good practice for life, as long as we enjoy the process. Yeah, the process of challenging ourselves, trying new things, and using our practices to kind of push those limits a little bit, where we bring about courage and strength, and all of the things that I promote on this podcast all of the time, that I think come from having a regular yoga practice. But I think I might have said enough on this, but yeah, I might leave it there. Ciao.